Welcome everyone to the presentation and oral exam of Tomas Ward for his capstone project concerning his internship with Sheboygan on evaluating tree risk. He has a lot of insights to share with us, and I'm looking forward to the presentation. Tomas has joined the NRES program with a background in English as well as concentrations in geography and horticulture from University of California, Berkeley. And then a wide variety of design and restoration and botany career moves after that. And so we've really enjoyed having Tomas in the program. He brings a variety of experience and is always a very interested participant and asks lots of good questions. So it's been great having him in the program. And I'm excited at the insights that he has gained and will be sharing with us today. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Tomas.
Thank you very much, Piper. I'd like to take a brief moment to thank everyone that's here attending this presentation. I really do thank you for coming to see what I've been doing. The title of this talk is Evaluating Tree Risk Assessment Protocols in a Medium-Sized City. We know that healthy urban trees are associated with numerous social benefits. However, they also present some risk when whole trees or limbs fall during storms. Tree risk assessment, or TRA, is the process for examining urban forest populations and prescribing mitigation or monitoring for higher risk individuals. For my master's capstone, I did an internship with the City of Sheboygan Department of Public Works, completing a TRA census for street-owned trees in the city during the winter of 2019-2020, alongside the city forester. And I also interviewed tree care professionals from peer municipalities in order to better contextualize arboriculture practices and make recommendations. This internship began to take shape when I was broadcasting to local government my interest in an internship position that would help me expand my geographic information systems portfolio. And the GIS project specialist with Sheboygan, Andrew Bartell, was receptive and agreed to have me in for some discussion, and that's how the ball got rolling. You see in this slide a photo of the Sheboygan Harbor. It does have a long history as a port city, transporting raw materials such as timber as well as industrial materials. I've included two slides here, two photos of some of the businesses that Sheboygan is known for today, the headquarters for Acuity Insurance and also Volrath Kitchen Equipment, are two contemporary businesses, and that shows that there is a service sector economy as well as a remaining industrial base in the city of Sheboygan. The Department of Public Works was my internship sponsor. When I did come in for discussions with staff from that department, I mentioned that I have interest and experience with forest ecology research. And it turned out that the city forester in Sheboygan, Tim Bull, had recently been trained and attained the tree risk assessment qualification, which is the industry standard that's presented by the International Society of Arboriculture. So our interests complemented each other, and we set about to design a capstone experience focused on tree risk assessment. And the other photo in this slide is from Google Street View. It's an intersection in the residential part of Sheboygan, showing just a few of the trees that the forestry crew is responsible for. These were my internship goals: complete visual basic assessment of the city-owned trees, document that the survey time and effort needed. So if someone in Sheboygan decides in the future, hey, we want to do complete tree risk assessments on an ongoing basis, how much time is that going to take us? We wanted to provide some data to have an answer to that. Third goal was to create a record of a reasonable standard of care being exercised in the case of any litigation. We were also seeking to interrogate the TRAQ methodology, see if any improvements could be made there. And finally, to consult with peer municipalities to find out if they had some practices that we should be incorporating. I want to make the case here that natural resources is a good venue, a good department for taking a look at some of the problems and issues associated with TRA. The omnibus sciences of natural resources and geography can be broadly divided into physical and social science, and there are general applications there, as well as specific things that I think apply to tree risk assessment. So on the physical science side, we can look at things like biometrics and learning about tree defects. The climate and weather conditions certainly come under that heading, and we can also learn something about the target infrastructure that we are seeking to protect on the physical science side of things. Tree risk assessment also has a human dimensions component. Things like the practices of people doing the assessments, public tolerance for risk, and the success or failure of tree care policies can be looked at through the lens of the social sciences within NRES. So this list is by no means exhaustive, but I did want to make the point that our department is well suited to make these inquiries. So I mentioned in an earlier slide that the city forester in Sheboygan had been trained in this tree risk assessment qualification method. This two-step matrix is how trees are evaluated in that protocol, and it relies on three input variables that are determined on site. Those three variables are likelihood of failure, likelihood of impacting target, and the consequences that occur if failure and impact do occur together. And so for each individual tree, we'll proceed through this two-step matrix and ultimately arrive at a risk rating ranging from low, moderate, high, up to extreme. The documented history of TRA systems goes back to the 1960s, and a lot has been written about it. Different systems have been developed. I wanted to bring in a few observations from a 2017 article by Koser and Smiley that I kept in mind as I was considering starting this project. So from their introduction, they observed that few researchers have attempted to validate or compare risk assessment methods employed by people working in the field. And then later they note that personal biases and individual perceptions of risk likely account for variability associated in those second two of the three risk variables: likelihood of impact and consequences of failure. So those in particular are possibly susceptible to surveyor bias. And again, there are a limited number of studies that have sought to validate to validate the predictive capability of systems such as TRAQ. One such study, however, that does exist is Chris Rooney and co-authors from 2005. Their study site was in South Kingston, Rhode Island, and they were ultimately seeking to demonstrate that a windshield survey, in other words, one conducted from behind the glass of a moving vehicle, had comparable predictive quality or was comparably capable of finding defects in hazard trees, in risk trees. And in this slide, I've highlighted that for those trees that had the highest level of risk, and they use a point system here, so those trees that are in the 10 to 12 point category, the windshield survey found almost 90% of those major defects that were identified by the walking survey, which spent considerably more time with those trees. So this study gives us some justification for what we tried to do in Sheboygan, and also a point of departure for our own methods. Here is some information about the survey that Tim and I did between December of 2019 and February of 2020. I've included a photograph of the hard copy field map that we used in the truck to document our daily progress and ensure that we were completing the entire street grid for the city of Sheboygan. And in my results table, a few things to note. I've highlighted that we did approach 673 trees per hour, which is quite a few. And also that we had a very limited number of trees in the higher risk category. So high risk and moderate risk trees, a total of only 18, which is 0.1% of the entire population. Comparing that to Rooney and his co-authors in 2005, they were assessing trees at a rate of somewhere between 200 and 300 an hour, and their percentage of higher risk trees was closer to 6-7%. So fewer trees per hour and a greater total of trees in higher risk category. And I think it's borne out both by their paper and also having spoken to Chris by phone. A major reason for that is the fact that in South Kingston, there are many areas of natural areas where the trees are volunteers and have not been managed as intensively, whereas in Sheboygan, most of the trees are planted specimens, have decades of consistent tree care. So if a given municipality wants to look at these two projects to determine how long it might take them to conduct this survey, they might do well to consider their land use history, and history of tree care in that place. This slide has to do with prioritizing risk zones. In our survey, we treated the entire street grid as being of equal interest without demarcating any sort of risk zones. However, in the 2003 report, Community Tree Risk Management, by Pokornoy and co-authors, it is recommended that communities do create variable risk zones in order to manage their assessments efforts. So on the right-hand side is a GIS exercise that I did, strictly hypothetical, to show what that might look like. And I took all of the school building locations in the city and placed quarter-mile buffers around them. And I found that the road network contained in those buffers represented about 25% of the city. So given budget or manpower constraints, if I'll say more about this, I ultimately do come around to recommend a complete inventory of all streets. However, given constraints and limitations, it is possible to reduce the time and effort needed to show an appropriate standard of care by creating priority risk zones. And that might include different criteria such as hospitals or anything that a certain community thought was important. I did have an aspiration that this project would become a longitudinal study, and it could add to the literature of projects that had attempted to validate risk assessment systems. And in order to do that, I imagined that we would be capturing real-time data of where and when trees were failing. And that would allow us to compare the performance of the risk set of trees that we identified with the general population, which were in the low risk category. So this slide is meant to represent a time sequence of events following storm damage. So photo 1, the wind blows, trees fall, causing possible damage and hazards. Next, photo number 2, crews are deployed to respond and make those areas safe, remove obstacles and hazards. And then finally, the record of those visits enter into the digital record. And Sheboygan is using ESRI data platforms, so ArcGIS Pro and ESRI Collector mobile app. And in this, in photo number 3 on the right, you see a sample of how the work orders, ESRI work orders occur in Collector. Now, because not all of the storm damage data was captured in work orders, I think that it's no longer feasible to consider our risk set of trees as the baseline for a longitudinal study. There were some severe windstorms in the spring and summer of 2020 that caused trees to fail, and not all of that data was captured due to the expedited emergency response nature of the work. Having said that, Sheboygan assures me that they're now committed to making a work order for each and every response, no matter what the conditions. And that has to do more with, not as much with validating the TRAQ system, but rather simply for the sake of their own workflow management. So given those records being in place for future efforts, the study I had in mind might be possible. Shifting gears to the social surveying that I did as part of this project. It was determined, along with my research advisor Piper, that some sort of outreach to other city foresters was needed in order to identify some good practices and compare what we're doing in Sheboygan. So to start on that aspect of my project, Dr. Hauer provided me with a sample of actually a subset of communities that had responded to his publication from 2018 in collaboration with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. And so I had in hand a list of 43 communities who had answered yes to Hauer and Lorenz's instrument, asking, do you have a written tree risk assessment plan? And the goal here was not necessarily to create a comprehensive, wide-ranging data set, but simply to identify a small number of people who were engaged in this discipline seriously and were willing to speak with me by phone about their practices. So of those 43 communities, 9 of them returned an email survey to me. And I have here the tabular results from that survey. And the things that jump out at me from this table is that the responding to the question, which of the following tactics to tree risk assessment apply to your community? Response to citizen complaints was universal, and windshield surveys were close to being complete throughout everyone that responded. Each of these communities I followed up and requested a phone survey, or an interview, and I did conduct an interview with the city forester from Green Bay about his work. And also there was a snowball survey component to my questionnaire, inquiring about whether anyone knew of another community that they thought was doing a particularly good job with tree risk assessment. And through that, the village of Shorewood, north of Milwaukee, was identified, and they also agreed to interview with me by phone. So I conducted 2 interviews, and my focus there had to do with how records are kept. I identified in a previous slide that in terms of community science, those record keeping processes tend to be paramount. And so I was hoping to get into how different communities do record the work they do, um, and then also legal issues. It's known that um, having experienced legal claims for damage due to tree failure is associated with having a tree risk assessment plan. And I was curious to know about the experiences that some of these city foresters have had dealing with legal claims. A nice thing that arose from that part of the project was that it became clear that Shorewood and Sheboygan had some areas of mutual interest, and it would be worthwhile to go further with some discussion. So in December of last year, we scheduled a Zoom meeting between our TRA team in Sheboygan and Shorewood, and there was a lot of good information exchanged. Sheboygan has developed a lot of expertise with using those work orders in order to demonstrate and report how work has been done, and the time sequential processes for an individual tree can be easily seen through that work order workflow. And in Shorewood, they are starting to manage that and taking better advantage of some of the ESRI tools. And so I think that was beneficial. And information flowing in the other direction. Shorewood has experience setting up a gravel bed nursery for tree seedlings, and that was of interest to the folks in Sheboygan. Key findings of my internship: a complete risk assessment windshield survey is feasible for the city of Sheboygan on a 2-year time frame using TRAQ, and other similarly situated municipalities might find that that's true for them as well. I have some anecdotal information that city foresters report feeling better prepared to respond to legal liability claims arising from tree fall damage after having completed a recent TRA survey. And additional work is needed to design a longitudinal validation study of municipal tree risk assessment using the TRAQ and methodology and ESRI platforms. So that brings my prepared remarks to an end. I would like to take time to make some acknowledgments. Thank you to my parents, Jean and Bob Ward. Thank you to all my informants who spoke with me on the phone for this project. At the NRES department, Renee Gracken, Karen Klaus, Piper Hodson, thank you for project design assistance and editing. Dr. Bob Hudson, thank you for your willingness to serve on this research committee. Dr. Rich Hauer, thank you for helping me get oriented to this field of study and for sharing all of your research. At the Department of Public Works in Sheboygan, thank you, Ryan, and especially to Andy Bartell and Tim Bull. Thank you. Thank you for taking an interest in me and facilitating this internship and master's degree opportunity. And I would be very pleased to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Tomas. Nice job.
Thank you.
At this point, we will open up the floor to any questions from our guests. As I said, you're welcome to turn on the mic or you can put it in the chat.
Maybe one, just what are some common risks that, like examples of risks and then remedies for some of the trees paths?
There's a long litany of tree defects that certified arboriculturalists are trained to know about. So that could include cracks in the entire length of the stem of a tree. The most common risk that we identified was simply broken off limbs, dead limbs broken and hanging in trees. And I'm glad you asked the question, because that dealing with those clearly existing hazards, such as hanging deadfall, became a concern or a point of question for us during the survey. And the way we responded to this was, rather than calling that a hazard tree, the city forester would simply create a work order for his crew to address it. So if there was an obvious immediate threat, it didn't go into our risk database. It was simply taken care of, usually within a week, by the crew based on that work order system.
Thank you for your question, Tom. Do any of our guests have other questions?
What about the balance of breeds of tree? I don't know what the term is, but did you collect additional data when you're going through, or is it strictly, what was the scope of the assessment? Did you collect any additional data, like the varieties of trees, or is that something that's already in the database?
That is in the database already. Sheboygan has done a good job of having a mostly complete database of their trees. So things like year planted and tree species are already known. And the only data we were getting was those three matrix variables that we needed in order to give a final assessment. And the species balance mix is also interesting. We have of course the emerald ash borer decimation of the ash population, which has changed up the species mix of many cities and towns in this bioregion, and Sheboygan is seeking to respond with diverse mix of species plantings to add to resilience going forward.
If there aren't any more guest questions, then we will go ahead and say thank you very much to the guests who joined us today. We always appreciate having an audience. And now would be the time to leave the Zoom session, and we will commence with the committee's questions.
Thanks a lot.